For the agent that must be in the know, Medicare Industry Insider discusses critical insight, noteworthy trends, and upcoming issues in the Medicare market.
Deciphering and debating the legislation, regulation, and what's happening in the market. I'm Jalen Jackson.
And I'm Rachel Bremeyer, and we're going to talk shop, dive deep into these complex topics, and make them understandable and actionable.
If you've ever wondered where the world of Medicare is going and how to prepare for the future, Medicare Industry Insider is the resource you've been looking for.
Hi, I'm Rachel Bremeyer, Executive Sales Director at Senior Marketing Specialist.
And I'm Jalen Jackson, Compliance Officer with McNerney Management Group. You're here with us at the Medicare Industry Insider Podcast, and today we're going to talk a little bit about pharmacy benefit managers and kind of their evolving place in the Medicare industry.
I like the word ecosystem. I think you threw that out originally, but it's always been in the healthcare ecosystem. But I think the big question today that we're going to discuss a little bit more in depth is, are they still providing the necessary services and value for what they originally were scheduled to be for, or have they worn out their welcome a little bit? So we'll dive into that a little bit more today.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the question is, what's the future of PBMs? Where is their place in the market? And for anyone not familiar, again, pharmacy benefit managers, and they're really these kind of third-party companies that function as kind of an intermediary between an insurance provider, a plan, and the people who actually manufacture prescription drugs. So if you've ever wondered why certain drugs are and are not covered by your insurance plan, or why this drug costs $5 and this one costs $50, it's because of the PBM. They are the entity that is in charge of negotiating those rates, negotiating which drugs get covered, and kind of look through how to best put together a package of coverage for an insurance plan.
Right. I mean, originally, if you think about it, a drug company to go out and get people to utilize them, to create networks, to process claims, all of that stuff, that would have been so difficult. So that's where the PBM came into play. It's just, we'll gather the networks, we'll process claims, we'll negotiate drug prices, we'll take care of rebates, create the formularies, everything that you can think of that just simplifies. If a drug comes out, they did all the hard, heavy lifting of creating the drug.
Sure.
The PBM will help get it out without too much work. So that was originally why they were created.
Yeah, and they were really designed with kind of playing both sides of the coin. The insurance provider, the person creating an insurance plan for a commercial group or for a Medicare drug plan, whatever the case may be, they're sitting there looking at this gargantuan list of every medication that for every condition that exists in the market, going, how do we decide what to cover, how much to charge, how do we build a network of pharmacies? The PBM says, I've got you, I'll figure that out, and then you can just buy into my network, buy into my formulary that I have created. For the drug manufacturers, exactly like you said, they're sitting there going, how do I get insurance to pay for my drug? Right. How do I make sure that it is being covered so people can afford it, so they can take it? So they had kind of that dual value proposition. You'll notice that none of the people I mentioned so far have been clients. And that's really kind of where the bad rap that PBMs get comes from. But at the end of the day, kind of that original intention was, we're going to lower costs by helping plans manage those costs. We were going to keep premiums low. We were going to make sure people did have access to medications they need. Whether PBMs are still doing that or not is obviously the big thing that's up for debate.
Yeah, and another thing that it's probably has been in the news quite a bit recently is just the monopoly of PBMs. Looking at all of them, there are a lot of them, but honestly, if you look at it, the three big players are going to be CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum, which make up essentially about 80% of the market. So I think that comes into another element of do they have too much control in this industry?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the big things to remember is, there's about 66 main PBMs in the market, but when three of them control 80% of the market, it's not that there's no competition. It's looking more at, man, that is a lot of drug money, literally drug money flowing through these three entities. And, it's really causing a lot of friction. And, we've seen over this past year especially, but even the past few years, Congress taking a look at things like spread pricing, that difference between manufacturer rebates and what they're charging pharmacies for a drug. and kind of how PBMs are making out like bandits on some of these drugs. So that's probably an important thing to talk about, is kind of where PBMs actually make their money.
Right. Yeah. I mean, PBMs are going to be making their money on a lot of different things, like manufacturer rebates, which we've kind of discussed earlier, pharmacy clawbacks, plan administrators, rebates, obviously. It's an interesting thing because they've got to make their money. They're the third party. They're not the people who make the drugs, and they're not the ones who sell the drugs. It's in between. So are they actually getting the value of what they initially came here for both parties?
Absolutely.
And like you said, the clients were never involved in here, but the intent and why it's in the news so much recently is because drug prices and the power of the PBMs are definitely getting recognized, because the end goal should be the clients and should be the prices of the drugs.
Costs, yep.
We even had the big issue with the Aduhelm drug, last year?
Yeah.
Gosh, with, potentially increasing the Part B premium because it would have been a Part B drug. So that definitely got into the news of like how expensive drugs potentially could be.
Yeah.
So what are they actually doing? What are PBMs doing if they're that expensive?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point about as drugs continue to get more and more expensive. I think it was just a few months ago that the FDA approved a hemophilia A treatment that was going to run like $3.5 million per dose. That was kind of a one-time drug. It was, you take a dose and you're good. It was a gene therapy, but it's still just astronomical cost for these drugs. And again, the big thing is, we talked about from the get-go, how does that drug get on your formulary? Why is this drug covered and this one's not? The kind of sneaky open secret is those manufacturer rebates. If I make a drug that does the same thing as one of your drugs and I want to make sure the PBM covers mine on all of their plans, I'm going to say, listen, for every dose that someone gets prescribed, I'm going to kick back a little bit to you. Kickback's a dirty word, of course, and that's really how you should think of it, but legally speaking, it's a rebate. But they have things like that. When they build their pharmacy networks, they put those provisions in for requirements to sell certain amounts of certain drugs. Obviously, if you're a local pharmacy, you really can't do anything about what drugs doctors in your community are providing people that use your pharmacy. You can't just like bet on enough people having any particular health condition. And unfortunately, what we see right now, and again, at big odds in Congress right now and in a lot of regulatory agencies, is these clawbacks, where if you're not filling enough prescriptions of a given drug, they will lower your reimbursement rates on that drug at the pharmacy level. So lots of things that are really hurting sections of the care continuum or the health ecosystem, as we've said in the past. But then there's also some interesting little companies that are kind of working that spread between manufacturer price and PBM payments.
Yeah, you've got GoodRx, CleverRx, you've got all of those drug discount cards. And I know that I've even personally gotten clients who've reached out and said, is this real? Because I'll get it in the mail and it looks like it's a fake card or like a credit card, and they're like, is it actually going to give me a discount? Yes, but at what cost too?
Absolutely. So I think there's a lot of things going on there. Like we said, they're working the spread. The difference between what a manufacturer is rebating that PBM and what that PBM can sell that drug for. Those pharmacy discount programs are just taking a little slice within the slice that PBMs are grabbing. And like you said, at what cost? The biggest thing is, it is running drugs outside your insurance. So it's not applying to your deductible. It's not applying to your max out-of-pocket costs. So there's times where it absolutely can save clients money, but there are also times where it may be disadvantageous in the long run, depending on what your kind of year-long drug costs look like.
For sure. Yeah, if you've got a situation where you don't want to hit your deductible and keep some of your drug costs lower, it might be good to use a discount card to like pay for a more expensive drug, but it could go back and forth on that situation. And then the other cost that I was also thinking of, so you hit a really good point on that aspect of your deductible, but also they're not really regulated. Like the information that they're gathering is not really regulated like, any other personal health information potentially could be. So there's been in the news recently about several of them selling information out just to make additional money. So being cautious as an agent, just knowing like what are these companies doing with your clients' data too. Yeah,
absolutely. And that HIPAA and other privacy laws are definitely something that have been in the news a lot lately, as you already mentioned, but I think the big thing to remember is that everyone's making money somehow. And, it's kind of that old adage that if the product is free, it's because you're the product. And that's kind of how you have to look at some of those, is if you're not paying anything for this service, you have to wonder, what are they actually selling? And in this case, it's a lot of data and a lot of that spread pricing that they're getting. But what you're seeing now is a lot of these PBMs trying to do some small things to kind of improve their image, maybe throw folks off the scent, so to speak, depending on how you want to look at it. But a lot of things to try to improve the perception of PBMs in the market.
Yeah, you actually are bringing up a good topic, because we have the Pharmacy Benefit Manager Transparency Act of 2023. Essentially what that's doing is basically it was introduced in the Senate in January, and the main goal is to ban spread pricing and clawback reimbursement. So you're going to see, certain carriers, like we've seen Express Scripts, for example, launch initiatives to have more price transparency recently. So that is something, like you said, to throw a little bit of the scent off, is, look, we're being transparent, like here's how much things actually cost. So we are seeing that in the news, in addition to local pharmacies being a little bit more supported.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing, Express Scripts has been in the news a couple of times lately, one of the big three PBMs, for kind of some of their voluntary efforts to increase transparency, offering some new PBM contract options to plans where they can pay, more of a flat fee. And then they'll have access to, direct access to the pricing that the PBM actually gets. So shrinking that spread to next to nothing. And then, as you mentioned, with local pharmacies, looking at PBMs, creating some initiatives to better reimburse at a higher rate local, small, rural, non-chain hospitals. And again, definitely some good things in the short term for those providers. But it definitely leaves you to wonder what's going on behind the scenes that's making that voluntary act so appealing. And I think the answer is pretty clear. They're trying to get ahead of any actions that Congress or some regulatory agency may want to take going forward.
Right. It's definitely something to keep an eye on, because, like you said, it's throwing the scent off a little bit. So the other thing that we wanted to go into a little bit deeper is insulin costs and big drug companies, because insulin has been in the news left and right. It's definitely 1 in 3 seniors have some sort of diabetes, so a lot of people are using insulin. But insulin prices have risen quite a bit. So that's definitely been in the news about, capping it at the $35. And we're looking at some companies even going a little bit more, taking things into their own hands to lower that cost a little bit more.
Absolutely. We saw that, of course, start with Medicare, with the Inflation Reduction Act, and actually even before that, things like the Part D senior savings model, capping that at $35, and it's done a few things. It's definitely increased access to insulin for folks that need it. But of course, commercial payers, ACA, uninsured, those large swaths of people that were not on Medicare were still kind of left out in the cold to help cover some of those costs, and arguably help recoup some of the costs that these manufacturers were paying, were giving away, so to speak, to Medicare beneficiaries. But I think what we've seen now is 3 of the largest insulin manufacturers have committed to lowering and capping those insulin prices. $35 a month for all payers, uninsured, ACA, no matter what, even commercial payers. And several others have capped it at maybe a percentage of what it is now, things like that. Most of them to start January 1st, 2024. Correct. And I think there's something really critical about that date that we have found out, that means that really this move is great PR for these drug companies. It kind of circumvents the PBM altogether in a way, because it's them capping that retail cost of it, and it actually can save those manufacturers a lot of money.
So kind of going back through what is the value of the PBM in this situation? they kind of got cut out.
Sure. It's still networks, it's still access to plans, but because of these kind of conflicting regulatory burdens between some things going after the manufacturers, this increased scrutiny on PBMs, there's a lot of things where that PBM is kind of being cut out of the loop with things like this.
For sure. Well, we're seeing another act, the American Rescue Plan of 2021.
Sure.
That's another thing that we're seeing in the news recently. But essentially, the gist of it is the prices of the drugs were higher than the rebate. So what that was going to do is going to require the drug companies to basically owe on those medications. So and owe to Medicaid.
Exactly.
So it's interesting watching the situation kind of play out.
Yeah, and that's why, so when all these companies said, hey, we're going to drop that price of insulin, we're going to cap it at $35, it actually is probably going to make them more money because of some of those provisions in the American Rescue Act where those rebates to Medicaid are based on the list price or the retail price of that drug. So by dropping it to $35, not only are they getting rid of potentially billions of dollars in rebates that they might have owed, it is also potentially actually going to increase the amount Medicaid actually pays for those drugs. So they're kind of making off like bandits with this as a drug company. And again, for something like insulin, where, you know, just on the Medicare side, Medicare beneficiaries, there's over 3 million insulin dependent Medicare beneficiaries, but definitely a lot of folks in the commercial and private payer market as well that depend on these drugs for their health. And now they may be able to get it a little cheaper. But again, we're looking at program level effects. Medicaid may actually be spending more money on insulin now than they were previously.
It is. I feel like everything we've been seeing in the news has been definitely a give and take and trying to find a happy medium in terms of price transparency, the value of PBMs, how to make, you know, healthcare and drugs affordable. So we'll continue to see all of that, and definitely we will be keeping our finger on the pulse of all of that as well. But I guess as an agent, what kind of things would you say based on this topic that they could be doing?
I think the biggest things are just to kind of be aware, you know, be aware of how PBMs affect pricing for your clients, be aware of how some of the upcoming changes that we may talk about in future episodes with the Inflation Reduction Act and other pending legislation can affect that pricing, and understanding what PBMs are managing your products. So, you know, just a quick comment on things like vertical integration, you know, those three largest PBMs, Optum, Express Scripts, Caremark, all owned by three of the largest Medicare insurance providers as well, United Healthcare, Aetna, CVS, and Cigna. So definitely looking at who's actually managing the products you're selling, who's managing those formularies, those prices, and understanding where the money comes from. Because you know, we can argue all day long about, you know, what price, you know, kind of this price manipulation, the $35 caps, other proposals in Medicare may do. But a lot of those companies are not just going to choose to make less money. They're going to try to make it up somewhere. Yeah.
So as an agent, if your client particularly likes a pharmacy, for example, CVS, you're probably going to end up with an Aetna type company for the Part D to take care of them, and just being aware that they'll kind of be potentially stuck in that network through that year, because it's a one-year contract. So making sure as an agent you are aware of that, you know the connection between the PBMs and the Part D, and what carriers own vertical integration, own which PBMs is going to be very important, because you are basically looking at, you know, what pharmacies are in your region, you know, what reputation do they have, because essentially that client's going to be in that plan for a year, and they're going to be utilizing that pharmacy for a year. Absolutely.
And I think, you know, to get to the speculatory side, as we continue to see price pressures on PBMs, price pressures on plans with the way reimbursement through the Inflation Reduction Act works, I think, you know, those networks, it's something that we could see shrink a little bit. Those closely held or closely associated providers, Aetna, CVS, Caremark, Optum, Express Scripts, we're going to continue to see, I think, a little more consolidation of networks. It's entirely possible that beneficiaries may have fewer choices for which pharmacies they go to.
They're probably already seeing that too.
They are already seeing that. I know, just on the PBM side for kind of federal programs, we saw Express Scripts take over administrating TRICARE benefits in October last year, and it was all over the news. TRICARE loses 13,000 pharmacies. So as soon as they switched over to Express Scripts because of, either timelines or disagreement over contract negotiations, things like that, around 13,000 primarily local mom and pop type pharmacies either chose or could not afford to be a member of that Express Scripts network. Now, they've gained several of those back since October, but it definitely caused a pretty large stir. And I think we can continue to expect that, not just with your local pharmacies and your small chains, but even on the mail order side. As more and more people go to mail order because of costs, that's another way that these PBMs can kind of cost shift things and maybe make a little more on the back end compared to actual local pharmacy fulfillment.
Yes, yeah, that is one of their main things too, is mail order specialty pharmacies. So 100%. So to wrap up today, I think this is, you make up your decision, your own mind if PBMs are cutting pulling their weight in the industry, essentially, or as we said, the healthcare ecosystem that they've been in for decades. We went through like the original reason why they were created. They still show some value in that, but then there's definitely a lot of backpedaling in terms of trying to get some better PR in the industry right now because of drug prices and, like you said, networks and vertical integration. All of that can definitely cause some negative PR in the industry, in the news as well. So I think as an agent, make up your own mind. We'll keep our finger on the pulse of PBMs and what the future holds. Legislation is completely up in the air.
Absolutely. I think that's the big thing to remember is, be aware of all these things, understand what it does to your clients, but a lot of pending legislation all the time that could change things at the drop of a hat, like we saw with the Inflation Reduction Act. But again, big takeaway, be educated, be informed, make sure you can answer client questions about why certain things are priced the way they are. But again, big issues, big kind of interactions in that ecosystem. They're kind of a linchpin in certain ways. But again, we'll continue to keep an eye on this and other aspects of the Medicare industry, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Thank you very much.